The 17th of January, 1941, Maxwell Field, Alabama. The air hung cold and still over the runway, the kind of January morning where frost clung to the wingtips of training aircraft and breath turned to vapor in the pre-dawn darkness. Inside a corrugated metal hangar, 53 young men stood in formation, their leather jackets stiff with cold, their hands thrust deep into pockets. Most were farm boys from Iowa, clerks from Pennsylvania, mechanics from Detroit. None had logged more than 60 hours in the air. A few had never flown at all. They stood there, shoulders square, eyes forward, unaware that they were about to become part of the most ambitious industrial transformation in aviation history. A transformation born not from preparation, but from desperation. Outside, a lone instructor climbed into the cockpit of a Stearman PT-17 biplane, its yellow paint dull in the morning grey. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life, propeller blades slicing through the Alabama mist. This was the sound that would become the heartbeat of American air power, not the thunder of bombing raids or the scream of dive bombers, but the stuttering, persistent growl of training engines turning novices into warriors. But on that morning, in January 1941, America possessed something it could scarcely admit to itself. An air force that existed largely on paper, a skeletal force of pilots who were, in the cold arithmetic of modern warfare, utterly unprepared for combat. The United States Army Air Corps stood at the threshold of global conflict with fewer than 3,000 rated pilots. The Navy had perhaps 2,500 more. Against this, Germany had already deployed over 15,000 combat-experienced aviators, men hardened by the Spanish Civil War, by the lightning campaigns across Poland and France, by the relentless bombing of Britain. Japan possessed nearly 10,000 carrier and land-based pilots, veterans of brutal campaigns in China, masters of carrier operations that American planners barely understood. The arithmetic was stark, undeniable, terrifying. America had the industrial capacity to build aircraft in numbers that would darken the skies, but it had almost no one trained to fly them into combat. The problem was not merely numerical, it was philosophical, structural, embedded in decades of peacetime thinking. Throughout the 1,930 seconds, American military aviation had remained a small elite club. Pilot training moved at the pace of a gentleman's pursuit, slow, selective, methodical. Candidates underwent extensive physical and psychological screening. Training took 18 months, sometimes longer. Classes graduated in batches of 20, perhaps 30 men. The emphasis was on quality, on producing a small cadre of exceptional aviators who could master both flying and the emerging technologies of radio navigation, instrument flight, and aerial gunnery. It was training designed for peacetime air shows and limited deployments, for an air force that existed to defend borders and project limited power. It was training utterly unsuited to the demands of total war. By late 1940, as Britain stood alone against the Nazi onslaught and Japanese forces pressed deeper into China, American military planners confronted a reality that shattered their assumptions. If when America entered the war, it would need not thousands but tens of thousands of pilots, perhaps hundreds of thousands. The projections varied, but all pointed toward a number that seemed impossible. Somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 pilots would be required to crew the bombers, fighters, and transport aircraft needed to wage war on 3 continents. At the current training rate of 300 pilots per year, it would take generations to build such a force. America didn't have generations. It might not even have years. What followed was not a plan so much as an industrial revolution imposed upon the art of flying. In March 1939, with war already raging in Europe, Congress had authorized the expansion of the Army Air Corps to 5,000, 500 aircraft and 3,200 officers. By May 1940, as France collapsed and the Dunkirk evacuation unfolded, President Roosevelt called for the production of 50,000 aircraft annually, a number so staggering it seemed like fantasy. But aircraft meant nothing without pilots. In the summer of 1940, The War Department set a target that made even the aircraft production goals seem modest: train 30,000 pilots per year. Within months, that figure would rise to 50,000, then 70,000. The numbers climbed not because planners had developed a coherent strategy, but because the machinery of total war demanded bodies in cockpits. The young men who arrived at training fields across the American South in early 1941 came expecting the old model, the careful, methodical progression that had defined military aviation since the First World War. Instead, they encountered something closer to a factory assembly line, a system being invented in real time by instructors who were themselves often barely qualified. The War Department had scoured the country for anyone with flying experience: bush pilots from Alaska, crop dusters from the Midwest, barnstormers who had spent the Depression years performing aerial stunts at county fairs. Men who had logged thousands of hours in civilian aircraft suddenly found themselves wearing Army Air Corps uniforms, teaching farm boys who had never been more than 50 feet off the ground. The infrastructure emerged with stunning speed. Across the South and Southwest, where weather permitted year-round flying, training fields materialized from red Alabama clay and Texas scrubland. Local communities, hungry for federal dollars during the Depression's lingering twilight, offered land and labor. Civilian contractors built runways, hangars, barracks, classrooms. By the end of 1941, there would be dozens of training bases. By 1943, hundreds. The scale was industrial, unprecedented. Maxwell Field in Alabama became the administrative heart. Randolph Field in Texas, with its distinctive Spanish colonial tower, emerged as the west point of the air. Primary training bases sprawled across the landscape: Avenger Field, Coleman Field, Cochrane Field, each one a small city devoted to a single purpose: transforming civilians into combat aviators. The training itself became a study in compression, in determining what was essential and what could be sacrificed to the demands of speed. The old 18-month program collapsed into 9 months, then 8, then 7. Primary training, learning to fly, mastering basic maneuvers. Solo flight dropped from 12 weeks to 9. Basic training, transitioning to more complex aircraft, and beginning formation flying, shrank from 10 weeks to 8. Advanced training, where pilots specialized in fighters, bombers, or multi-engine aircraft, compressed from 12 weeks to 10. Every hour mattered. Every day counted. The curriculum became ruthlessly efficient, stripping away anything not directly related to combat survival. In primary training, cadets flew Stearman PT 13 seconds and PT 17 seconds, sturdy biplanes whose forgiving flight characteristics allowed inexperienced pilots to make mistakes and survive them. The aircraft were simple fabric-covered wings, open cockpits, fixed landing gear. But they taught the fundamentals: takeoffs and landings, stalls and recoveries, spins and emergency procedures. Instructors pushed cadets through a relentless schedule. Ground school in the morning, where they learned meteorology, navigation, aircraft recognition, and military protocol. Flight training in the afternoon and evening, weather permitting. Solo flight came quickly, often after just 8 to 10 hours of dual instruction. There was no time for extended preparation. Either a cadet grasped the basics, or he washed out. The washout rate was brutal. Of every 100 men who entered primary training, perhaps 60 would advance to basic training. Another 10 or 15 would disappear before advanced training. Some failed because they couldn't master the physical demands: motion sickness, spatial disorientation, inability to coordinate hands and feet in the complex dance of throttle, stick, and rudder. Others failed written examinations in navigation or meteorology. Still others cracked under the pressure, overwhelmed by the compressed timeline and the knowledge that every flight could end in a fiery crash. Between 1941 and 1945, more than 15,000 pilots and crew members would die in training accidents, more than the entire combat losses of the Army Air Corps in World War I. Training killed. It killed frequently. But the alternative, sending unprepared pilots into combat, would kill more. Those who survived primary training moved to basic, where they transitioned to more powerful aircraft, typically the Vultee-BT, 13 Valiant, known universally and without affection as the vibrator for its tendency to shake violently at certain speeds. The BT-13 was heavier, faster, more complex than the Stearman. It had a retractable landing gear, a two-way radio, and enough power to get a careless pilot into serious trouble. Here, cadets learned formation flying, instrument flight, and night operations. They flew in all weather, through rain, through clouds, through darkness, because combat would not wait for ideal conditions. Instructors screamed into radio headsets, correcting mistakes in real time, demanding precision. A formation had to hold position within feet, not yards. An instrument approach had to hit altitude and heading markers exactly, or a pilot would fly into a mountain in combat. There was no room for approximation. Advanced training brought specialization, and the aircraft that would define a pilot's war. Fighter pilots transitioned to AT-6 Texans, single-engine trainers with retractable gear and enough speed to simulate combat maneuvers. They learned air-to-air gunnery, dive bombing, ground attack. They practiced dogfighting, learning to push an aircraft through high-G turns that grayed out vision and pressed breath from lungs. Bomber pilots moved to twin-engine aircraft like the AT-10 Wichita or the Beechcraft AT-11 Canson, learning multi-engine coordination, formation bombing, and navigation over long distances. A few, destined for heavy bombers, went directly to B-17 seconds or B-24 seconds, four-engine monsters that required a crew of 10 and handled like flying apartment buildings. Every specialty demanded different skills, different instincts. A fighter pilot had to think and react in fractions of a second. A bomber pilot had to maintain formation through flak and fighters, trusting in discipline and the men around him. Both would face death, but the deaths would come differently. The industrial scale of the training program required more than bases and aircraft. It required a complete rethinking of how knowledge was transferred. The Army Air Corps turned to civilian experts, to psychologists and educators who studied human learning. They developed standardized curricula, identical across dozens of bases. They created training films, thousands of hours of footage showing proper techniques, common mistakes, emergency procedures. They designed simulators, primitive by modern standards but revolutionary for their time. Link trainers that mimicked instrument flight without leaving the ground. Gunnery trainers that projected enemy aircraft onto screens. They broke flying down into discrete, measurable skills that could be taught, tested, and graded objectively. It was Taylorism applied to aerial combat, scientific management imposed upon the chaos of war. The instructors themselves became products of the system they were building. Many were themselves recent graduates, men who had earned their wings only months earlier, but who were held back from combat assignments to teach the next wave. They were young, often younger than their students. They worked 12-hour days, 7 days a week. They flew multiple training missions daily, demonstrating maneuvers, correcting errors, occasionally taking controls when a student froze or made a fatal mistake. The mortality rate among instructors rivaled that of combat pilots. A moment's inattention, a student's panic, a mechanical failure, any could turn a routine training flight into a death spiral. But the instructors kept flying because the system demanded it, because every pilot they trained might save 10 others in combat. What the young men in training expected, what their civilian backgrounds had prepared them for, bore little resemblance to what they experienced. Most had grown up in the Depression, in an America where scarcity was the dominant fact of life. They expected military training to be harsh, to involve deprivation and hardship. Instead, they encountered abundance on a scale that bewildered them. Training bases offered 3 hot meals daily in mess halls that never seemed to run short of food. Barracks had heat in winter, electric lights, running water. Flight gear appeared seemingly without limit, leather jackets, fleece-lined boots, goggles, gloves. If equipment wore out, it was replaced immediately. There were no shortages, no rationing, no waiting. This abundance extended to the aircraft themselves. On any given day, a training base might have 50, 100, 200 aircraft on its flight line. If an engine failed, mechanics replaced it overnight. If an aircraft crashed, another appeared to take its place. The young pilots witnessed an industrial capacity that defied their understanding. They came from a world where cars were precious, where families saved for years to buy a single vehicle. Here, aircraft machines infinitely more complex and expensive were treated almost as disposable. A pilot might fly 3 different aircraft in a single week, each with slightly different characteristics, each maintained by a ground crew that worked through the night to keep the training schedule on track. The contrast with what German and Japanese pilots experienced was stark, and for those who survived the war to reflect upon it, deeply symbolic. German training, which had begun the war with a sophisticated system that produced superb combat pilots, degraded steadily as fuel shortages and mounting losses consumed resources. By 1943, Luftwaffe training had collapsed to a shadow of its former self. New pilots arrived at combat units with 150 hours of flight time, sometimes less. They had minimal gunnery training, almost no instrument instruction. They were expected to learn in combat or die trying. Most died. Japanese training suffered similarly. Early in the war, Japanese naval aviators were among the finest in the world, products of a brutal selection process and exhaustive training. But as the carrier fleet bled pilots in the Solomon Islands and at Midway, the Japanese training system could not replace losses. Training times shrank. Standards dropped. By 1944, Japanese pilots attacked Allied fleets with barely enough skill to keep their aircraft airborne, let alone conduct effective attacks. American pilots, by contrast, arrived at combat units with 300 to 400 hours of flight time, sometimes more. They had flown in every weather condition. They had practiced emergency procedures until reactions became instinctive. They had fired thousands of rounds in gunnery training, dropped hundreds of practice bombs, flown countless formation missions. They were not yet combat veterans, and their first missions would still be terrifying, disorienting experiences. But they possessed a foundation of skill that gave them a fighting chance to survive long enough to gain experience. And if they were killed or injured, the training system would produce 2 more pilots to replace them. The symbolic weight of this abundance of an industrial democracy that could simultaneously produce aircraft, train pilots, and equip armies on 3 continents was not lost on those who witnessed it. German prisoners of war, brought to camps in the American interior, watched training aircraft pass overhead in formations of 20, 30, 40 aircraft. They counted them, adding up numbers that exceeded the entire training capacity of the remaining German flight schools. Japanese prisoners told interrogators that they knew the war was lost when they saw photographs of American training bases, when they understood that America was producing pilots like automobiles on an assembly line. The abundance was not merely material, it represented a different conception of warfare, a democratic industrial model that valued each pilot enough to invest months of training and thousands of dollars in equipment, yet possessed enough confidence in its systems to produce them in numbers that would have seemed impossible to any previous military power. The curriculum itself reflected American pragmatism, a willingness to adapt and change based on combat experience. Early training emphasized individual skill aerobatics, precision flying, single combat tactics, carried over from World War I. But as combat reports flowed back from Europe and the Pacific, the curriculum shifted. Formation tactics became paramount. Fighter pilots learned to fight in pairs, wingman and leader abandoning the solitary duels of earlier eras. Bomber crews trained together, learning to function as a single organism under fire. Gunnery training incorporated lessons from actual combat. Deflection shooting, lead pursuit, the geometry of high-speed interception. Navigation training expanded to include celestial navigation for long-range missions over featureless ocean. Survival training taught pilots to function if shot down, to evade capture, to use emergency radios, to survive in jungle or desert or Arctic conditions. The training bases became small cities, self-contained worlds, where everything focused on a single purpose: They had their own power plants, water systems, hospitals, churches. They employed thousands of civilian workers, instructors, mechanics, administrative staff, cooks, nurses. They transformed local economies, pumping federal dollars into small southern towns that had barely survived the Depression. They also transformed American culture, bringing young men from every region and background into close proximity. Farm boys from the Midwest met city boys from Brooklyn. Southerners trained alongside New Englanders. The training bases became inadvertent laboratories of social integration, melting pots where regional and class differences dissolved, or at least diminished under the pressure of shared purpose and mutual dependence. In the air, origin mattered less than skill, and in combat, even less than that. For the young men undergoing training, the experience was transformative in ways that went beyond flying. Most had never travelled more than 100 miles from their birthplace. Suddenly they were crossing the country by train, living among strangers, operating complex machinery that could kill them in an instant of carelessness. They learned to calculate wind drift and fuel consumption, to read weather patterns and navigate by stars. They learned to function on minimal sleep, to make split-second decisions under stress, to continue operating when fear threatened to overwhelm them. They learned, in short, to become professionals in a system that treated warfare as a science, as a problem that could be solved through training, discipline, and industrial organization. The symbolic object that tied together this entire system, the recurring element that represented American industrial democracy, was not a weapon or a specific aircraft. It was the logbook. Every pilot carried one, a simple bound notebook where every flight was recorded: date, aircraft type, flight time, mission type, instructor signature. The logbook was a record of progression, a tangible measure of transformation from civilian to combat pilot. It was also a promise. Every entry represented an investment: fuel burned, instructor time, aircraft wear, ground crew labor. Multiplied across thousands of pilots, those logbook entries represented billions of dollars, millions of man-hours, an industrial effort that dwarfed anything previously attempted in aviation history. The logbook symbolized something deeper than mere record-keeping. It embodied the democratic principle that every pilot mattered, that each one was worth the extraordinary investment in training and equipment. German and Japanese pilots might have been individually skilled. Many were superbly talented, but they were treated as expendable, as resources to be consumed in pursuit of strategic objectives. When they died, the systems that produced them could not replace them. American pilots were also expendable in the cold logic of war. Men died by the thousands, but the system that created them was not. The training pipeline was robust, redundant, capable of expanding to meet demand. If losses exceeded projections, training was accelerated. If new aircraft required different skills, curricula were updated. The system learned, adapted, evolved. By December 1941, when Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor and America entered the war it had been preparing for, the transformation was still incomplete. The training system could produce perhaps 30,000 pilots that year, impressive compared to the 300 per year of 1938, but still insufficient for what was coming. But the infrastructure was in place, the bases existed, the instructors were trained, the aircraft were rolling off production lines, the system was ready to scale, and scale it did. In 1942, American training programs produced 52,000 pilots. In 1943, the number reached 65,000. In 1944, it peaked at over 90,000. These were not merely numbers. Each represented a young man transformed, a civilian given hundreds of hours of training and sent to fight across the Atlantic or Pacific. Each carried in his logbook the record of that transformation, the evidence of an industrial democracy that could simultaneously wage war on 3 continents and maintain a training system that churned out pilots faster than the enemy could shoot them down. The graduates of this system went to war with advantages their enemies could not match. They flew aircraft designed with pilot survival in mind: self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plating, redundant systems. If shot down over friendly territory, a rescue system brought them back. If they survived their tour 25 missions for bomber crews, 200 combat hours for fighter pilots, they went home. The system valued experience enough to preserve it, to prevent the death spiral of mounting losses and declining skill that consumed German and Japanese air forces. American pilots in 1945 were better trained, more experienced, and more numerous than they had been in 1943. German and Japanese pilots, by contrast, had devolved into barely trained teenagers thrown into hopeless battles. The cost of building this system was measured not just in dollars but in lives. Training accidents killed relentlessly. A student pilot attempting his first solo would misjudge a landing and cartwheel across a runway. An instructor would push too hard in a demonstration of combat maneuvers and exceed the aircraft's structural limits. A formation would enter clouds and disintegrate, aircraft colliding in the grey blindness. Mechanical failures claimed others' engines that quit on takeoff, propellers that separated in flight, control cables that snapped. Between 1,941 and 1,945, more Americans died in training accidents than the Army Air Corps lost in all of World War I. The bases had their own cemeteries, rows of white crosses marking the price of industrial-scale pilot production. Yet even this grim arithmetic reinforced the central reality. America could afford the losses. It could absorb the deaths of 15,000 men in training because the system produced 350,000 pilots over the same period. The mathematics of attrition favored the democracy that could train replacements faster than combat could consume them. This was not callousness, but calculation, the cold logic of industrial warfare. Every training death was a tragedy, but every pilot who died in training without adequate preparation was a tragedy multiplied by the lives he might have saved in combat had he been better trained. The men who survived this crucible emerged changed. They had arrived as civilians, products of a peacetime democracy that many had never expected to fight for. They left as combat pilots, carriers of a skill set that marked them as members of an elite, yet an elite produced in such numbers that it lost its traditional exclusivity. They were mass-produced experts, standardized warriors, and in that paradox lay both their strength and their peculiarly American character. They had been trained not as knights or samurai, as individual champions, but as interchangeable parts in a vast machine. Yet that machine valued each of them enough to invest months and thousands of dollars in their preparation. The transformation was ideological as much as technical. Young men who had grown up in the Depression, who had known scarcity and hardship, encountered in military service an abundance that seemed almost miraculous. The training bases, with their endless supplies of food and equipment, with their libraries and recreation facilities and medical care, offered a standard of living higher than many had known as civilians. This was not accidental. The military understood that morale mattered, that men fought better when they felt valued, when they saw evidence that their lives mattered to the system that commanded them. The abundance was strategic, a weapon as important as any aircraft or bomb. When these pilots arrived in combat theatres in England, in North Africa, in the Pacific Islands, they brought with them not just flying skills, but an ingrained confidence in American industrial power. They had seen the training bases, had witnessed the assembly lines of pilot production. They knew that if they died, 2 more would replace them. If their aircraft was shot down, a factory would build another. This knowledge bred a particular kind of courage, not the fatalistic bravery of men who knew they were doomed, but the aggressive confidence of men who believed they were part of a system too large, too productive, too resilient to be defeated. German pilots, encountering American formations over Europe in 1943 and 1944, noted this quality in combat reports. American pilots, they observed, fought with a reckless aggression that seemed to ignore losses. They pressed attacks even when outnumbered, accepting casualties that would have caused other air forces to withdraw. This was not because American pilots were braver or less concerned with survival. It was because they had been trained in a system that absorbed losses and kept functioning. They had internalized the industrial logic of attrition warfare, the understanding that tactical defeats could be acceptable if strategic objectives were achieved. They had learned that the mission mattered more than individual survival, because the system would continue even if they did not. Japanese pilots, facing American air power in the Pacific, encountered the same relentless pressure. In early battles, Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, Japanese aviators often held the advantage in individual skill and experience. But as the war progressed and Japanese training collapsed while American training expanded, the balance shifted irrevocably. By 1944, American pilots were encountering Japanese aviators who could barely fly, let alone fight effectively. The Turkey shoot at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where American fighters destroyed nearly 400 Japanese aircraft in a single day, was not a testament to American pilot superiority so much as a demonstration of what industrial training could achieve against a system that had broken under attrition. The legacy of the wartime training system extended far beyond the immediate conflict. The bases, once built, became permanent institutions. The standardized curricula, refined through combat experience, became the foundation of post-war military aviation. The marriage of military necessity and industrial organization pioneered in 1941 became the model for all subsequent American military training. The draft could bring millions into service, but effective training transformed them from civilians into soldiers, sailors, and aviators. The lesson learned between 1941 and 1945 was that scale mattered, that industrial organization could be applied to human skill development, that a democracy with sufficient resources could train its citizens to fight as effectively as any professional military class. For the individual pilots, the experience remained with them for life. They had been ordinary young men, distinguished by little except their ability to pass the physical and mental tests of pilot training. The system took them in, subjected them to a compressed education that would have been spread over years in peacetime, and sent them out as combat aviators. Many died. Many more survived to return home, carrying logbooks filled with hundreds of entries, each one recording a small increment of the transformation from civilian to warrior and back again. The final symbolic weight of those logbooks of the entire training system they represented became clear only in retrospect. They were evidence of what an industrial democracy could achieve when fully mobilized, when its productive capacity was turned entirely toward a single purpose. The training system was not elegant. It was not traditional. It possessed none of the martial romance of cavalry charges or infantry assaults. It was bureaucratic, standardized, sometimes maddeningly inefficient. But it worked. It produced hundreds of thousands of pilots when no other system in history had produced more than tens of thousands. It maintained quality while achieving quantity. It adapted to combat experience, incorporating lessons learned in blood into updated curricula that saved lives in the next training cycle. In January 1941, standing on that cold Alabama runway, the 53 young men in formation could not have understood what they were becoming part of. They knew only that they wanted to fly, that the war expanding across the world would need pilots, that this was their chance to matter. They could not have known that they were the first wave of the largest pilot training program in history, that the industrial system being built around them would define aerial warfare for generations. They could not have known that the abundance they would encounter, the endless aircraft, the hot meals, the new equipment, represented a strategic advantage as important as any technology or tactic. They knew only that the engine of that yellow Stearman biplane had started, that its propeller was turning, that somewhere in the program ahead lay their own first flight, their own transformation. The frost was burning off the wingtips now as the sun climbed. The instructor taxied the Stearman toward the runway, throttle forward, tail lifting, wheels leaving the ground. Up into the Alabama sky it climbed, tracing a pattern that thousands would follow, first solo, first aerobatics, first formation, first cross-country. Each flight recorded in a logbook, each entry a piece of an industrial miracle that would help win a global war. The sound of that engine, the steerman's distinctive growl, became the sound of American air power being born, not in the thunder of bombing raids or the roar of carrier launches, though those would come, but in the patient, relentless, industrial repetition of training flights that never stopped, that continued through rain and heat and loss, that transformed a nation of civilians into an air force that would darken the skies above 3 continents. It was abundance made audible, democracy made visible, industrial power transformed into human skill and sent aloft on wings that would carry it to every battlefield of the war. Years later, after the victories and homecomings, after the logbooks were closed and the bases were repurposed or abandoned, the men who passed through that system would look back on their training as the crucible that defined them. Not the combat, though that was more intense and memorable, but the training, the endless hours in the cockpit, the grinding repetition, the losses, the gradual accumulation of skill that appeared in their logbooks one line at a time. They had been shaped by an industrial system, but they remained individuals, each with his own fears and triumphs, each carrying his own memories of the day he first flew solo, the day he earned his wings, the day he learned that America's answer to being unprepared for war was not to avoid war, but to build a machine that could produce warriors faster than war could consume them. That was the larger truth, embedded in the frozen runways of January 1941. That industrial democracy, once fully engaged, could achieve what traditional military systems could not. It could train not an elite few but an entire generation. It could treat each individual as valuable enough to invest in extensively, yet produce them in numbers that overwhelmed any advantage in individual skill. It could lose battles and still win wars, absorb defeats and still grind forward, because behind every loss stood a training system that never stopped producing replacements. The young men on that Alabama runway in January 1941 could not see any of this. They saw only the next day's training schedule, the next hurdle to overcome, the dream of silver wings pinned to their chests. But they were standing at the beginning of something unprecedented, a transformation as complete as any in military history. America had no combat-ready pilots in 1941. Within 4 years, it would have hundreds of thousands, and the skies above 2 oceans would belong to them. That transformation began with industrial organization imposed upon the ancient dream of flight, with standardization married to individual skill, with American abundance channeled into the most ambitious training program the world had ever seen. It began in the cold dawn of a January morning, with the sound of a single training aircraft climbing into the Alabama sky, first of thousands, herald of a revolution that would reshape the face of war itself.